Some evenings arrive wearing the disguise of ordinary time. They look like any other Thursday or Saturday, unremarkable and forgettable. But then you glance backward through the years and realize those were the moments when everything changed, the hinges upon which your entire world turned. This is the story of one such evening and everything that came unraveled after. My name is Sarah. For 14 years, I inhabited a home constructed from schedules and sensible agreements, where love had slowly transformed into something closer to polite roommates sharing expenses. The granite counters gleamed without fingerprints, the mortgage was never late, and my husband, Robert, and I circled each other like distant planets, occasionally intersecting but never truly colliding. That summer, the house echoed with particular emptiness. Robert's consulting firm kept him perpetually in motion. Seattle one week, Atlanta the next, then Portland, then cities I stopped tracking. Our exchanges became purely functional. Did you call the electrician? The Hendersons want us over Saturday. I'll be home Wednesday, possibly Thursday. Every phone call felt like managing a shared spreadsheet rather than connecting with someone I'd once loved with desperate intensity. I stopped mentioning the silence that bothered me. How I'd begun talking aloud while preparing meals. How I'd glimpsed my reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. Someone who'd mastered automatic smiling, nodding at appropriate intervals, existing quietly in the margins of her own existence. Then Ethan arrived. The arrival. He was Robert's son from his first marriage, 23 years old, suspended in that uncertain territory between who you've been and who you're meant to become. He'd left graduate school, uncertain about his direction, and Robert suggested he stay with us temporarily while sorting things out. Just for a few months, Robert assured me, during one of his airport conversations. Help him find his footing. I agreed because that's what reasonable people do. They accommodate. They help. They don't imagine that temporary arrangements might restructure the entire architecture of their lives. Ethan moved in on a Wednesday afternoon carrying 2 backpacks and an old guitar. He was quieter than I'd anticipated, more watchful. Where Robert filled spaces with confident declarations, Ethan seemed to listen to what wasn't being said. He had his father's build, but none of his certainty, and there was something in his careful way of moving through rooms that made you curious about his thoughts. Those first weeks felt harmless enough. We established a pattern. I'd brew coffee each morning and he'd appear in the kitchen, hair uncombed, offering a quiet good morning before vanishing into job searches and online classes. Sometimes we'd encounter each other in the evening and we'd talk, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. He asked questions nobody had asked me in years. What books had shaped my thinking as a teenager? What had I wanted to become before life redirected me? Did I ever feel like I was performing a role someone else had written? I found myself answering honestly, perhaps too honestly. Found myself laughing at his dry observations about modern absurdities. Found myself anticipating those accidental meetings in the kitchen, the living room, the front porch where we'd sit as dusk painted the sky in impossible colors. It was innocent. I convinced myself it was innocent. But innocence is fragile, and it shattered on a Thursday evening in late July. The breaking point, Robert called around 6 to say his meetings had extended. Another week minimum. His voice carried that familiar tone of distracted apology, the sound of someone who'd already mentally moved too. Their next agenda item. I poured wine, more than usual, settled onto the living room sofa. The television displayed something I wasn't watching. Outside, thunder growled in the distance, and rain began drumming against the windows with insistent rhythm. Ethan came downstairs wearing a faded grey shirt and worn jeans. His hair was still damp from showering. He moved with that unconscious grace some people possess, completely natural, and settled into the chair across from me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that feels like its own language. Then he said, almost casually, you seem incredibly lonely. I laughed, deflecting. I'm fine, just tired. But he didn't accept the deflection. His eyes held mine, and there was something different in his gaze, something searching and tender and impossibly direct. I don't think you're fine, he said quietly. I think you've been invisible, in your own house for a very long time. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through carefully maintained surfaces. I should have changed the subject. Should have made an excuse and gone upstairs. Should have reinforced the boundaries that were supposed to exist between us. Instead, I said, "And what makes you think you can see me?" "Because I've been invisible too," he replied. "And I recognize it in other people." That's when everything shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but completely, like discovering a door you never knew existed. The confession. We talked until dawn crept across the horizon. He told me about growing up between two households, always feeling like an intruder in both, never quite belonging anywhere, about watching his father build a new life that seemed to have minimal space for him, about feeling like an afterthought, a complication, someone to be managed rather than truly known. I told him things I'd never voiced aloud. How I'd lost myself somewhere in the decade of being reasonable, of not creating waves, of accepting that passionate connection belonged to youth and I should appreciate stability. How I'd stopped recognizing my own desires because it seemed easier than acknowledging them. As the hours dissolved, the atmosphere between us changed, thickened, became charged with something neither of us was willing to name, but both of us felt. When he reached across the space separating us and touched my hand, my entire body responded with electric recognition. When he spoke my name, barely above a whisper, something dormant inside me woke with a gasp. When he leaned forward and kissed me, every alarm in my mind started screaming. Every moral principle I'd constructed my life around rose up in protest, but beneath all that noise was something louder, the desperate drowning need to feel alive again, to be seen, to matter to someone in a way that felt real and immediate and undeniable. So I kissed him back, and in that moment I understood how people make choices they never imagined making, how boundaries that seemed solid can evaporate in the presence of genuine connection, how loneliness can become its own gravity, pulling you toward anything promising to ease the ache. The morning after, morning arrived with brutal clarity. Sunlight poured through windows like an accusation. I couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't reconcile what had happened with who I believed I was. I told myself it was an aberration, a moment of weakness brought on by too much wine, too much loneliness, and the particular vulnerability of a stormy night. Something I could contain, compartmentalize, eventually forget. But the heart keeps its own records, and denial is a poor eraser. I tried rebuilding walls, kept my distance, made my words brief and functional, threw myself into house projects, anything to Avo. ID moments when we might find ourselves alone together. Ethan didn't make it easy. He'd find reasons to be near me, would leave small notes tucked into books I was reading, would catch my eye across rooms with a look that said he remembered everything, that he knew exactly what I was trying to pretend didn't exist. And the terrible truth was, I wanted him to remember, wanted him to push against my resistance, wanted permission to stop fighting what was pulling us together. 2 weeks later, on an afternoon when rain returned to tap against windows, we stopped pretending. The summer, what followed was a summer that existed in stolen moments and whispered conversations, midnight encounters in the kitchen, mornings when Robert was traveling and the house belonged only to us. A parallel world we built in the spaces between the regular one, knowing it couldn't last, knowing it was wrong. Unable to stop, I lived split in two. There was the version of me who existed in daylight, who smiled at neighbors and returned Robert's calls and maintained the appearance of normalcy. And there was the version who came alive in shadows, who felt desire and guilt in equal measure, who was both horrified by what she was doing and unable to give it up. Ethan would sometimes look at me with something like anguish and say, "This isn't sustainable, we both know it." And I'd nod, agreeing, even as my hands found his face, pulling him closer. The guilt was constant and consuming. I'd lie awake cataloguing my betrayals, not just the physical acts, though those were damning enough, but the emotional ones. The way I'd started thinking of Robert as an obstacle rather than a partner. The way I'd begun to resent his very existence, his reasonable expectations, his oblivious contentment with our hollow marriage. I hated who I was becoming, but I also felt more alive than I had in years, and that was its own terrible truth. The reckoning. August brought everything to a head. Robert announced he'd be home for 2 full weeks. A deliberate break, he said, to reconnect. He'd noticed my distance during phone calls and wanted to address it. We'd have dinners together, maybe take a weekend trip, remember why we'd chosen each other in the first place. The announcement landed like a verdict. Ethan found me in the garden that afternoon, where I'd gone to have something resembling privacy for my panic. "What are we going to do?" he asked, and there was something young and lost in his voice that broke my heart. "We're going to stop," I said, forcing the words out. "This was never real, Ethan. It was just escapism for both of us." "Don't do that," he said sharply. "Don't minimize it. Don't pretend this meant nothing." "What did you think was going to happen?" I asked, hearing the cruelty in my voice and unable to stop it. "That we'd run away together? That this could somehow become a normal relationship? You're my husband's son." The words hung between us, ugly and undeniable. "I know exactly what I am," he said quietly. "I've always known, but I also know what I felt, what we both felt. And you can't just erase that because it's inconvenient. But that's exactly what I tried to do." The pretense. Robert came home the following Monday with flowers and reservations at the restaurant where we'd celebrated our anniversary years ago. He was trying, genuinely trying to bridge the distance between us, and I played along, smiled, nodded, pretended the distance was just natural drift, something that could be fixed with intentional effort and regular date nights. Ethan barely spoke during those 2 weeks. He'd appear at family dinners, polite and remote, then disappear into his room. Our eyes would meet across tables or in hallways, and in those glances I saw everything we couldn't say. The long, the resentment, the grief for something that never really had a chance to exist properly. Robert, oblivious to the currents running beneath the surface, commented on how well we all seemed to be adjusting, how nice it was to have family around. I wanted to laugh or scream. Instead, I poured more wine and kept smiling. 3 days before Robert was scheduled to travel again, Ethan made his decision. The departure. I found him packing, movements efficient and final. "Where will you go?" I asked from the doorway. "Does it matter?" He didn't look up from the duffel bag he was filling. "Ethan, please, don't," he interrupted. "Don't apologize or try to explain or make this easier." It wasn't wrong because it was complicated. It was wrong because neither of us was brave enough to be honest about what we wanted. "What you wanted," I repeated. "Ethan, you're 23. You don't know what you want." He finally looked at me then, and his eyes were older than they should have been. "I wanted someone to choose me," he said simply. "Just once, to be someone's first choice instead of their convenient option or their escape or their guilty secret. But that was never going to be you, was it?" I had no answer, because he was right. He left the next morning while Robert was at an early meeting. No dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation, just a note on the kitchen counter thanking us for our hospitality. Robert found the note and shrugged. Probably for the best. Kid needs to figure out his own path anyway. I nodded, agreed, said something about how young people need independence. And then I went to the bathroom and was sick. The aftermath, the months that followed, were perhaps worse than the affair itself because the guilt didn't disappear with Ethan. If anything, it intensified. Took up permanent residence in my chest like a stone I couldn't expel. Robert noticed my increase. In withdrawal. Suggested couples therapy. We went twice before I couldn't bear sitting on that couch, looking at a stranger, pretending our problems were about communication styles and quality time, when the truth was so much darker. I thought about confessing. Imagined the conversation. Practiced the words during sleepless nights. But I never did. Couldn't decide if holding the secret was more selfish than revealing it, whether confession would be about seeking forgiveness or simply offloading my guilt onto someone else. So I carried it alone. Time moved forward because that's what time does, indifferent to our dramas. Robert and I settled into a new version of our distant coexistence. He traveled less, trying to be more present, not understanding that presence and true intimacy are entirely different things. I went through motions, hosted dinner parties, maintained friendships, volunteered at the community center, built a life that looked from the outside perfectly acceptable, but inside I was haunted, not by regret exactly, though there was plenty of that, but by the recognition of what I'd discovered about myself, that I was capable of betrayal, that my moral foundations were less solid than I'd believed, that given the right circumstances, the right loneliness, the right connection, I could do things I'd once thought were unthinkable, and perhaps most disturbing, that some part of me didn't regret it as much as I should. The years between, occasionally I'd see young men who resembled Ethan, and my heart would stutter. I'd wonder where he went, who he became, whether he found someone who chose him first, whether he told anyone about that summer, or whether he carried it as silently as I did. I hoped he'd forgotten, hoped he'd moved on completely, built a life where that brief, intense connection was just a strange footnote barely remembered. But I also hoped he had. And because if he'd forgotten, it would mean I'd been wrong about what we shared, that it had been nothing after all, just two lonely people using each other temporarily. And I needed to believe it had meant something more than that, even if that meaning came wrapped in guilt and impossibility. 3 years passed. Robert and I continued our careful dance. We attended weddings and funerals, celebrated holidays with forced cheer, talked about everything except what mattered. Then one evening, completely unexpectedly, Robert said, "I know I haven't been the husband you needed." We were sitting on the back porch watching sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, the same porch where Ethan and I had once sat before everything changed. "What?" I managed. "I've been thinking about it," Robert continued, staring at his drink rather than me. "How checked out I've been. How I let work become more important than us. I'm not blind, Sarah. I know you've been unhappy." My throat closed. This was the moment, the opening to finally speak truth. Instead, I said, "We've both made mistakes." He nodded, accepting this, never pressing for details. And I understood that some truths would remain unspoken, that we'd chosen, both of us, to preserve a certain version of reality rather than excavate what lay beneath. The present day, we stayed married, not out of passionate, renewed commitment, but out of inertia, comfort, and the peculiar human ability to adapt to almost anything. Our marriage became something like friendship, companionship, a mutual agreement to share space and resources and a last name. Was it enough? I don't know. Enough for what? For survival? Certainly. For contentment? Sometimes. For the kind of deep connection I'd briefly tasted that summer? Never. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps we don't get everything. Perhaps life is about choosing which compromises we can live with, and then learning to live with them. Still, there are moments when the past surfaces unbidden. I'll be cooking dinner and hear a certain song, and suddenly I'm back in that summer, feeling everything at once, the guilt and the desire and the terrible exhilarating sense of being fully alive. Consequences be damned. Or I'll see rain against windows and remember whispered conversations in darkened rooms, the weight of secrets, the particular intimacy of doing something you know is wrong with someone who understands exactly how wrong it is. Or I'll catch my reflection unexpectedly and see not the person I've become, but the person I was during those months, split between two versions of herself, trying desperately to reconcile them and failing completely. The truth about forbidden things is this: they mark you. Not in obvious ways. You don't walk around with visible scars announcing your transgressions, but something shifts fundamentally. You understand in a way you didn't before that rules and boundaries are more fragile than they appear. That righteousness is often just untested principle. That any of us, given the right circumstances, might surprise ourselves with what we're capable of. I used to think character was fixed, that good people made good choices and bad people made bad ones. Now I understand it's more complicated. We're all capable of both. The question isn't whether we'll be tempted, but what we'll do when we are, and how we'll carry whatever choices we make afterward. Sometimes I wonder if Ethan thinks about that summer, if he's forgiven me for being too cowardly to choose him, or forgiven himself for wanting to be chosen. If he's found what he was looking for, or if he's still searching. I'll never know. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some stories are meant to remain unfinished, existing as permanent questions rather than answered narratives. What I know now, what I do know is this: I learned that loneliness can make us reckless. That connection, real connection, is intoxicating enough to override judgment. That betrayal isn't always about not loving someone. Sometimes it's about desperately needing to feel loved, seen, recognized as existing. And I learned that every one of us, works in progress, flawed, complicated, capable of both tenderness and selfishness, often simultaneously, trying our best and failing in ways we never anticipated. Robert and I will probably stay together until one of us dies. We've built too much shared history to dismantle it now. We're kind to each other mostly. We've learned to coexist without demanding more than the other can give. Is it what I imagined when I was young and believed love was supposed to be all-consuming? No. Is it what I deserved after what I did? Maybe. Is it enough? That question doesn't have a simple answer. The house is quieter now. Robert retired last year. We spend our days in companionable routine, reading, gardening, watching television shows we forget immediately after they end. Sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, I'm back in that summer. I feel the weight of impossible choices, the rush of forbidden connection, the particular pain of wanting something you can't have and having something you shouldn't want. And then I wake up, make coffee, continue forward. Because that's what we do. We carry our secrets and our guilts and our complex contradictory truths, and we keep moving through our days, hoping that time will eventually smooth the rough edges of what we've done. The guitar in the corner. The guitar in our spare room sits untouched now. Robert never plays, and I can't bring myself to because some objects become repositories for memories too heavy to confront directly. But sometimes, when the house is especially quiet, I'll walk past it and remember Ethan sitting on the porch, strumming random chords, looking lost and young and impossibly complicated. And I'll think, we were both trying to escape loneliness and ended up creating more of it. That's the real lesson, if there is one, that our choices ripple outward in ways we can't control, that searching for connection in the wrong places doesn't fill the emptiness. It just creates new kinds of isolation. Would I do it differently? Would I do it differently if I could go back? I've asked myself that question countless times. The honest answer is, I don't know. I'd like to say yes, that I'd be stronger, more principled, better. But I remember how invisible I felt, how desperate I was to matter to someone, how Ethan looked at me like I was actually there, actually real, actually worth seeing. And I'm not sure any version of me, however principled, could have resisted that. So I live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that I'm capable of both the person I want to be and the person I'd rather not acknowledge. We all are, I suspect. The difference is some of us have been tested and know exactly where our principles bend. Others haven't been tested yet and get to maintain the comfortable fiction that they'd never compromise. I don't have that fiction anymore, can't hide behind it or comfort myself with it. What I have instead is this: a life I chose to continue living despite everything, a marriage I chose to honor, however imperfectly, after dishonoring it. A daily practice of carrying complexity without being crushed by it. That's not redemption. I'm not looking for redemption, but it's something, a kind of honest reckoning with who I actually am rather than who I wish I were. And some days that's enough. Most days, actually, except for the ones when it isn't. When the past, faces and demands to be remembered, when I can't help but wonder about the life I didn't choose and the person I might have been if I'd been braver or more honest or less trapped by circumstances I'd spent years constructing. Those days are harder. But they're part of the truth too. The only ending there is, and if I've learned anything, it's that truth. Even complicated, uncomfortable truth is better than the alternative, better than pretending, better than denial, better than the kind of willful blindness I practiced for so many years before Ethan arrived and made it impossible to maintain. So I sit with it all, the guilt and the memory and the knowledge and the questions that have no good answers. I sit with the woman I was and the woman I became and the woman I'm trying to be now, and I keep going. Because what else is there to do? The story doesn't end. It just continues unfolding in ordinary moments, carrying its weight quietly, teaching its lessons slowly. And maybe that's the point. Maybe there is no neat conclusion, no moment of clarity where everything suddenly makes sense. Maybe there's just the ongoing work of living with what we've done and who we've been and what we've learned. The ongoing practice of being human with all the beautiful, terrible complexity that entails That's the story I'm telling you now, not because it has a satisfying ending, but because it's true. And truth, I've learned, matters more than comfort. Sometimes we don't get to choose between right and wrong. Sometimes we choose between wrong and then spend the rest of our lives learning to live with what we chose. That's not wisdom. That's just what it means to be human.